And now it's time for Mob Talk Radio with your host, Jeff Canarsie.
Yo, Lord Willin, Jeff Canarsie, Mob Talk Radio. Check it out. Yo, we stay quiet like Russell Buffalino when things will get ugly like Pepsi's death in Casino. Who do we know? No one, nobody. But we're all well respected like Della Croce and Gotti. I know wild nights have been a nocturne. Light up a cigar and watch your spot burn. You'll get patty whacked. I'm tough like Irish dock workers. Rubber guys with guys. Hooligans and block lurkers. Corner berserkers. Street savvy soldiers. You owe, you better pay. Don't make me say I told you. Code you don't betray. I say what I mean. Providence and Brooklyn all the way.
And welcome to Mob Talk Radio. I am your host, Jeff Canarsie. And let me tell you what. Right out the gate, I cannot believe, I really cannot fucking believe for the life of me, these fucking jerk-offs.
Joey Merlino, Joey Merlino, Joey Merlino, Joey Merlino, Joey Merlino, Joey Merlino, Joey Merlino.
I mean, in all fucking reality, and this is the last fucking thing I wanted to do to open my show today, but I've had it with these fucking jerk-offs. So here's the thing, right? So if you're a journalist and you're a mob author, you're a fucking radio show host, whatever it is that you fucking do if you're in this genre, there's a couple of things you don't fucking do. All right? The first thing is you don't implicate anybody in a crime. That's a fucking rat move. You don't mention a guy's fucking name with a fucking mob murder. You don't do... why would you even do that? What on God's fucking green earth could convince you that that's a bright fucking idea? And if you don't know what I'm talking about, and I don't even want to give really a minute of this to anybody. I just don't want to do it because I'm sick of talking about these two fucking pukes down in South Philly. They've lied nonstop. They tried to put fucking rat... They tried to tell fucking everybody Anthony Nicodemo was a fucking rat when he wasn't. They tried to say that Sharky was a fucking rat. He wasn't. They keep fucking doing this shit because they have nothing to fucking talk about. This fucking prick Scarpato, whoever the fuck his name is down there, they're going to try to tie him into South Philadelphia. They've already tried to do that, when there's no evidence to even fucking suggest that this guy was related to anybody, was in with anybody, was doing his grind down in fucking Delaware, whatever the fucking case may be. But when these guys sit there and they go on a fucking podcast, that's their new thing. They're doing a podcast now. And I listen to it with my hand over my mouth to keep myself from puking out of my fucking ass and my nose and my ears. Is they're going to talk about mob murders, and then they're going to tongue-in-cheek by throwing out a fucking name, and then instead of owning what the fuck they say, instead of owning it and being a man and saying, you know what, word on the street is X, Y, and Z did this, own that shit. Be a fucking man and fucking own it. Instead, they act like fucking little bastards, and they fucking say, well, you know, the FBI was looking at this one, they were looking at that one for a murder and this one. Well, what the fuck even go there for? Then they start jumping back. Oh, but just allegations. We don't want to, put anybody out there. You've already done it. The minute you fucking mention somebody's name with an alleged murder, you're putting fucking emphasis on it. It's reckless. That's the shit that pisses me off. I could give a fuck what these two do. If they want to sit in the bushes and jerk each other off while fucking watching soap operas on their fucking phones, I don't give a fuck what they do. They could fucking paint themselves like the fucking Smurfs and bang each other on fucking camera. I don't give a fuck. I have no problem sitting on the sidelines and saying, okay, if you're an author and you write books, all right, so nobody in the mob's going to talk to you anyway. So, of course, you're going to talk to fucking rats. All right, fine. I get it. It happens. But when you start getting to act like fucking Geraldo Rivera on the fucking on your fucking stupid TV show and on your fucking radio show and whatever the fuck it is you're going to do, the minute you start doing that, you lose all credibility. And from my perspective, it doesn't matter who the fuck they're talking about. But you don't insert guys in fucking crimes. You just don't do that. I don't give a fuck who you are. I'm not saying you got to be on my side of the fence with things or you got to be on their side of the fence with things. But for Christ's sakes, have some fucking balls. And if you're gonna tongue in cheek it to get fucking clicks and ratings and all this other shit, then be a fucking man and own what you say. But they can't do that. They never do that. They point the finger, they say what they say, and then they fucking run. I have never in my life ever seen two fucking individuals who sit in the bushes who claim that everybody in the streets is telling them shit. Why would anybody tell them anything of fucking consequence to begin with? They know it's going to end up on the news. I don't understand it. That's why I hate them. That's why I don't like them. That's why they're fucking jerk-offs. And I know a lot of people think I'm a jerk-off too. Don't get it wrong. That goes both fucking ways. But this has been a repeated thing that they've done. This is a repeated thing they will keep fucking doing because they got nothing to talk about. I love it when they try to talk about New York. They don't know a fucking thing that goes on in this city. They don't know anybody here. They don't have any fucking inside information. They don't have any street intuition when it comes to New York whatsoever. They don't know nothing about Sonny Franzese, but yet they want to talk like they know some shit there, and they don't. They want to mention guys' names in South Philadelphia. Oh, we've heard this, we've heard this. If you go and you watch their bullshit show from beginning to end, starting of when they started to now, they go back and forth, wishy-washy, this bullshit non-fucking stop. They don't mind putting a guy's name into nothing. They don't mind fucking sticking cameras over a fence and going, well, I saw this one sunning himself. Oh, by the way, here's a video of this guy reading his morning paper in his boxer shorts at his dinner table. What the fuck is wrong with you? Who does that? That's not fucking beat reporting. That's scumbag, borderline, fucking, what do they call that stuff? When these fucking guys, voyeurism. That's all that is voyeurism. And they can't fucking say 4 sentences without mentioning that guy's name with the wave clip I played at the beginning. And it just pisses me off because as a fucking man at some point, enough of the nonsense. Find a hobby. Go jerk yourself off in a pool or something with your little buddy. Share the same straw in a fucking drink because you obviously share the same fucking brain intelligence, the same wavelength, because neither one of you can mention anybody but the same 4 fucking guys. Oh, well, this one's going to fucking deny it. Yeah, because, an organized crime guy's going to say, yeah, George, you're right. You're right, I am doing that. Fuck out of here. So here's my thing. It's not a matter of having a disdain for... First of all, Stratweiser's a fucking punk. Let's get that straight out of the gate. He's a fucking punk. He is an utter fucking punk. And a scumbag and a liar and a jerk-off. That guy, of the two, I can at least tolerate George Anastasia to some fucking extent. This other guy is nothing but a punk and a bastard. And a bitch. He's a bitch. I'll say it to him. I have no problem with that. I don't like it because all he's doing is putting a name and a bullshit title and a fucking crime. And who do you think listens to that shit? The FBI, right? They even admit it themselves. They get inside tips from the fucking FBI. Well, how do you think they're getting them? Because the FBI ain't just going to jerk you off without you doing something to them in return. It's got to be a big fucking circle jerk for everybody to get something out of it. So don't think for 1 minute they're not telling the FBI this, that, and the third. They're going to sit outside of an alleged social club. Or they're going to say, this club moved here, this club moved there. Who gives a fuck? If you're such a fucking man, why don't you put the fucking camera down, you prick, and go knock on the door or walk in that fucking place? You won't do that, big mouth. You won't do that. And so the question becomes, do fucking journalists have a right to report? Absolutely. I'm not against anybody reporting anything like that. But report the goddamn fucking truth. Don't fucking spin a fucking narrative to get people to come watch your shit. Tell the fucking truth. You don't have to spin it any kind of way to get people to listen. Because if your word means something, and if what you do is nothing but factual, then there's nothing nobody can come at you over. Then people are going to listen anyway. But they got to spin shit. And nothing pissed me off fucking more than the Anthony Pergiano shit. I put that out months before them. They didn't say a fucking word. Then they wanted to be little cute fucks and be like, well, we don't we don't out the informants. Of course not, because they're your best fucking friends. You guys have like a verbal orgy with some of the biggest fucking rats. John Vesey, fucking Ron Previty. And while I understand, because I want people to get one thing that I'm saying here, and then I'm done. You have a duty. If you are a paid employee of Fox 29, whatever the fuck the case may be, which I thought the prick retired, apparently not, you have a duty to tell the truth. Putting salacious bullshit out there and reporting gossip and rumor as fucking fact is fucking, in my opinion, fucking reckless. He wouldn't have pulled that shit when Nicky Scarfo was boss. They'd have broke his fucking legs 6 ways from fucking Sundays. And so, from my perspective, while everybody has a right to report what they want, and I don't have a problem with that, tell the fucking truth. Tell the fucking truth. They don't do it. They make up shit. Then they quote their fucking sources, which at this point might as well be the ghosts of Napoleon fucking Bonaparte. Because nobody that I know or I've heard is talking to them. And so, yeah, well, they have a right to do what they want to do. And while I agree that George Anastasia's an intelligent guy, I also will say I don't think Anastasia's the one that's making up bullshit. Anastasia seems to be like the resounding voice of fucking reason sometimes. Whereas the other one is such a fucking fuckboy and has such a fucking hard-on for mob guys, especially Joey Merlino. It's ridiculous. It's fucking ridiculous. He has like a sick obsession with these guys. Anastasia at least can argue from a logistical point of view, and I'm not saying Anastasia gets it right all the time either. He doesn't, but he's not going to just out and out fucking lie. This other one will lie. This other one will, and he has, and I've called them on it. And so, listen, they're entitled to do what they want, but I'm also entitled to call them what they are, and punks, bitches, and bastards, because that's what they are. A real man doesn't need to sit in the fucking bushes. Be a fucking man, roll up outside a motherfucker's house, turn on your camera, then you do your shit. But no, they got to hide. They got to hide and do it. You know? This way nobody can see them jerking each other off in the fucking bushes. You know? This is the same type of dipshit that snorted pixie sticks back at fucking elementary school. Hey guys, watch me snort a line of sugar. So while some of their information is good, a lot of it is derived from bullshit and gossip. And the thing is if you're going to put a guy out there like that, which you shouldn't do anyway, then what fucking team are you on? You are not a fucking impartial fucking journalist if you fucking are putting out the nonsense the FBI wants everybody to hear. You, in fact, have become an arm of the FBI and, in fact, have become a rat piece of shit fuck. And that's what they are. That's what they are. They don't like me. I don't like fucking them. That's publicly noted. I don't give a fuck what they say. They could say I'm irrelevant and whatever the fuck, but they don't know the shit that I know. They don't get information like I get. All their information is supplied to by the tit of the FBI. And what amazes me is people still buy this bullshit. The minute I called them out on some shit that they did a couple of months ago, they were caught lying, caught openly lying, and I called them on it. They had nothing to fucking say then. And that's the thing. You have it. Be impartial. Call it down the fucking middle. If you're going to call something down the middle, call it down the fucking middle. But they don't, and they can't, and they won't. And Ratweiser's the biggest piece of shit of the two. That guy is a coward and a gutless bitch. I'll say it all day long. Nobody likes the guy. He thinks these guys like him. I don't know what the fuck is wrong. He must have water on his brain. He must have fucking done too many Quaaludes in the 70s or some shit. I don't know what the guy's problem is. But I bet you anything his fucking office has posters of Joey Merlino with red lipstick fucking marks everywhere. Oh, Joey. That's all this guy can fucking do. He's like a fucking obsessed. It's a little creepy. Anyway, all that being said, my point is that you got to call them out on the shit they do. You got to be honest. Look, people don't like what I do, and I get that, and I will always understand that. But one thing I don't do is I don't lie. I don't make shit up about guys. I don't fucking put unfactual information. I put the facts out. And then if you want to decide that you agree that somebody did something, then that's your prerogative. But at least I fucking put it out there. You can make an informed decision. These guys would have you believe crazy shit. You know, crazy stuff. And so that's why I don't like them, because a lot of people keep asking me, oh, why are you beefing on these guys? They're smart guys. One won an Emmy. Yeah, he could stick the Emmy up his fucking ass, too. The other one's a book author. Right. He's a book author that lied in his last book from beginning to fucking end. Factually speaking, and I've said this before, that now there are certain elements to that last book that George did that were accurate. That I can't argue with. But 85% of that shit was all lies. It's all fucking lies. But I do agree with George on some points of his last book. I'm not going to lie about that. And I will believe it or not, I was a fan of George Anastasia for a long time. I thought he was a good author. I thought he had good intel. But the more I keep seeing the last 10 years, it's all bullshit. It's all bullshit. There should be a disclaimer on his books. Caution. All fucking factual evidence comes from rats' mouths. That's what it ought to say. And I'm sucking the FBI's dick. That's what it should say, because that's the truth. Oh, and I'm gonna bring my little assless chap wearing piece of shit, disgruntled fuck who never amounted to nothing with me, my little sidekick, and he's gonna bring his 8x10 glossy Joey Merlino, hoping someday that Joey Merlino will sign something for him because it gets him off. It's fucking nonsense. All right, so here's what we got today on today's show. We're gonna do a large Q&A, and then we're gonna talk about the Morello mob. If you're unfamiliar with them, they would ultimately become the Genovese Crime family. We're going to do the history of that. So we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to get right to your questions. Stay tuned on Mob Talk Radio. On a given week, I'm out of town a lot. Whether it's Philadelphia, it's New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, wherever the case may be, I'm always looking for a place where I can sit down and have a great dinner. Ambiance is key. Price is obviously key. But the most important thing is the food good? And there's a place I want to tell you about today. It's called Saltwater at Margate. If you are going down to the shore, because I know a lot of people in Philadelphia go to the shore, especially Margate, you're missing out on a great restaurant if you haven't been there. The name is Saltwater Margate. It's at 9401 Ventnor Avenue, Margate City, New Jersey. The phone number there is 609-289-8078. You can also visit them online at saltwatermargate.com. This place is unbelievable. Not only is the food absolutely superb, the price is great too. They're renowned for their pizza and their gnocchi. They have all kinds of different things, from mussels to roast pork and Italian fare. So do yourself a favor, do me a favor, go and visit Saltwater Margate. You will not be disappointed. It is a place that I think at some point, if not already, there's going to be lines out the door and around the block. So if you're down on the shore, stop in, go to Saltwater Margate. At least check them out online at saltwatermargate.com. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. As far as the Q&A goes, there was probably over 100, 200 questions. I think it was like 175, very close to 200. We're not going to cover all of them, obviously. Otherwise, we'd be here all day doing it. This is one of the reasons why we do a fucking in-depth Q&A to begin with. But I picked, I think, 30, 35 questions to cover. If you're wondering how you can submit your questions to the Q&A, easily just go over to Facebook, type in Mob Talk Radio, and message me your question. Or usually on Monday and Tuesdays, I put out a list, and you can type in, it'll say Q&A and go, and you can just go ahead and drop in your question there. Now, obviously, I can't answer all the questions, and obviously a lot of repeats. So the one thing I would suggest is to find out if your question has been answered before. Go back to old shows specifically that have Q&A mentioned in them, and perhaps, I talked about it then. The other thing I wanted to bring up is that there is going to be a change coming to Mob Talk Radio. The change is going to be we are moving to pay site. The blog is going to remain free. So if you're unfamiliar with what our blog is, where we post articles and stuff like that, there'll be a link within this radio show where you can go. Now, what is this new adventure going to entail? Basically, the radio shows that you are getting now are no longer going to be free. I haven't decided when I'm going to launch that, but I've got the format I'm going to use. There's going to be an application you can download to listen to all the shows. It's going to be very, very inexpensive. But at this point, that's the direction that we are moving. I talked to a lot of different companies, a lot of different sponsors, and we've got some ideas about how we want to do this. But for the time being, I can tell you that it likely will begin next month. So you no longer will be able to go on YouTube and get this sort of stuff for free. That's just the reality of the direction we are moving. We attempted to keep it free by doing other things, but that just didn't work out. But that seems to be the direction that we are going to head. Now, as we step sort of further along the line, we will let everybody know, all of you, how exactly you can participate in that and exactly what it's going to entail. But I'm not in any rush. I'm not in any rush to do it. But I believe that the platform that we are going to use is like a podcasting website, which will have all the fucking releases. You will not be able to pay per show. You're going to have two options. One is going to be month to month. The other option is going to be 1 year subscription. Neither one of them is going to push over $42 a year. It's going to be very cheap and inexpensive. Right now, what we're going with is $250 a month if you pay for 1 year, and then it's going to be $3 a month if you go month to month. And for that, you're going to get 6 to 7 radio shows per year, or excuse me, per month. So that's the plan we're going to do. It's also going to be integrated with some videos, some documentary stuff we're working on. Will be put on that website as well. So it's going to be a whole bunch of things, but we're still sort of ironing out specifically exactly what we want to do. But the other thing that's very important is some of the shows that will come on this new platform are going to be, 1, live, absolutely live, so you can listen in live. 2, it's going to have a call-in phone number, so we're going to start taking calls. And yes, people are going to have the opportunity to scream rat and whatever the fuck else they want to yell at me. That's a feature that I definitely wanted to add. And I hate to leave YouTube, but at the end of the day, you just got to move forward. And I think giving people the availability to call in, I think doing live shows is pretty much where it's going to be at. And that's what we want to do ultimately at the end of the day. We may integrate the blog or some breaking news blog type of stuff on that site, but for the most part, it's going to be a one-stop shop of where you get the mob art and you can listen to the radio show specifically. And there will be live call-ins, live shows, live streaming, a whole bunch of different stuff. But we're working out the kinks of all of that now. So for people that are asking me the exact date of this, I can't tell you. It's going to be next month. It's not going to be this month. I may even push it back to April. But the reality is it is coming, and most of the shows that are on YouTube now will be left there. Maybe I'll carry over 3 or 4 to the new site. But basically there'll be an application you can download, which is free to download the app, and listen to all the shows. So it'll go right to your phone. It'll be on iTunes, Google Play, all of these other outlets, but it's also going to be protected to the point where if anybody gets a wise-ass idea that they think they're going to double download, you can't do it. There also are going to be particular names of people that we do not want associated with the site that we will block from the site immediately. A lot of people would say, well, why do that? Take their money. Because there's just people out there that all they want to fucking do is cause havoc and trouble. So we're going to make sure that we maintain that. It'll all be password protected. But that's how you will be able to get your shows directly to your phone, so you can listen to it in the car, what have you. But that is the way we're going to go. It looks, like I said, it's going to be $250 a month for a year, times 12 months. But then if you choose the plan of going month to month, then it's going to be a little more expensive, 3, which is cheaper than anybody else is doing it. Not only is it cheaper, but you're getting the most accurate information you're going to get ever about this particular genre. A lot of other people are doing this. They're charging an arm and a leg, and their content sucks. And they really don't have any inside people. They don't really know the streets. So not knocking anybody else that does it, but there comes a time when you just have to change, and that's what we are going to do. So as we get further and further along, we will definitely discuss that. All right, question number 1. If you were to rank the 5 families in order of brutality, how would you rank them in each decade from the 50s until now? I don't have all day to sit here, but I'm just going to rank them as far as last to first. Colombo, Lucchese, Bonanno, Gambino, and Genovese. That's just kind of how I see, obviously the Colombos back in the day in the 50s were killing people in the 60s. Look, they all kill people, but as far as how I'm going to rank them from then until now. Colombo, Lucchese, Bonanno, Gambino, and Genovese. I still think that ultimately, at the end of the day, if we're going to talk about the 5 families in New York, I think the Genoveses are still the strongest crime family in New York. They have been for a long time. Whether or not they're the most dangerous or not is something totally totally different, but that's just my opinion. All right, is there a mobster you would love to do a show on but just cannot get enough information as they were low-key? I've always thought a Funzy Thierry show would be great. Neil Delacroce is a harder one. Okay. I think I have talked about Funzy Thierry before in a couple of different shows. Looking for all the New Jersey stuff. Obviously, I talked a little bit about him. From my perspective, I mean, Neil Delacroce, look, there's a lot known on him, but the problem is that when you do stuff like this, there's so much limited information about these guys in their 20s. And that truly is, to tell a story, you got to tell them from when they first get involved in organized crime, what the situation was, how they rose through the ranks. I mean, we know what Neil Delacroce did from age 50 and on, but we don't know anything or not enough. And that's a part of the problem. Court cases, if you use PACER, they tell a certain kind of story as far as criminality goes, at least from an allegation perspective. But to know the little ins and outs, it's a little hard. And a lot of people that are related to these people just don't want to talk. And I don't blame them. Who wants to regurgitate shit that's 50 fucking years old? But that's Neil Delacroce is definitely a guy that I would love to talk about at length for 2 hours. But there's just not enough people willing to talk and tell stories and stuff like that. And so that's what makes it kind of tough. All right. When a mob boss is sentenced to life imprisonment, what makes some guys want to continue having control of the family from jail while other guys immediately name a successor? And when would the commission step in and if a boss doesn't wish to relinquish control? Well, we saw it in the case of the Bonanno specifically, the beef with Rusty Rastelli and then Joey Massino coming in. So we know that portion of it. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, look up Joey Massino on Google and whatever, and you could see all of that. But I think really it comes down to what the alleged imprisoned boss wants. I mean, if he's respected, it's harder for anybody to rival him. It's harder for people to take control of the family. And usually when a boss goes away, he installs a street panel on the streets just to keep everything quiet. He ultimately has control and say of everything that happens, but there's a panel who essentially just sort of carries out what the boss of the crime family wants. But I think in reality, it really comes down to ego and power. I mean, take Carmine Persico, for example. He never, in all the years he was in prison, relinquished control. He never gave it up. He might put his son in there. His son, goes away to prison for a long time for the rest of his life. And Carmine Persico effectively dies as boss of the Colombo crime family. Now he's no longer the boss, obviously, because he's dead. But I think it just depends on the type of support that you have. How much power you have, how feared you are, but I think it all comes down to ego. I mean, a lot of people would just, why relinquish control? I mean, I never understood if you're going away for the rest of your life. I don't see the point. But if there's a situation where you're going to get out, then obviously you want to maintain control. But I think it just comes down to certain individuals or whatever, and what they want. All right. In cities where the mob used to have pretty good okay, here we go. All right, so there used to be certain cities. This is the question. So certain cities where the mob used to have a pretty good stronghold, but now the numbers are down. Why would not bigger families put in a crew there? There is money to be made everywhere, and if a strong organization could really capitalize on them. I'm not really specifically sure what this person is asking, but I'm making the assumption here that what they're asking me is that if you take certain areas where the mob used to be and then they sort of fizzled out, how come stronger families didn't come in and put a crew there? It comes down to turf. It comes down to turf. It comes down to territory. If you're talking about L.A., L.A. is defunct. There's some other areas that are now defunct. But look, times are different. And especially when you look at lower markets, how much cash can really go around? I've always thought, Vegas would have been the one territory that always had the mob there no matter what. Even with the major corporations running the casinos today and stuff like that, I'm sort of stunned that there isn't a big crew there because there's money to be made in Vegas, even with legit gambling. Gamblers, if you're a gambler, you can't walk into a casino and borrow on credit. That's where bookies come in, and that's why no matter what anybody ever says, Gambling on the streets is never going to end. Bookies are never going to end. You can legalize it all day long, but for the people that need credit, Vegas isn't going to give them credit. Atlantic City is not going to give them credit, so they go to a guy who will. That's why you're never going to get rid of bookies. You're never going to get rid of organized crime involved in gambling. But the entire basis of credit is what keeps them in business. The minute that if Vegas started offering credit, then they don't have a reason to go to the mob. But as long as you can get credit from people, it's going to be that way. Plus, smaller local areas, have a tougher time expanding into a lot of different rackets. And we've talked about this before. Let's use Rhode Island for an example. Rhode Island's the smallest state. You have a couple of different rackets you can really hone in on. But when you compare that or contrast that to, say, New York is such a bigger area. It's much more vast. Construction rackets. In Rhode Island, you're kind of stuck with like a couple of different things. And as long as you're in a smaller area with rackets, it's a lot harder to just say, okay, we're going to move a crew in here because the last crime family or the last group that was here couldn't do things or couldn't handle their business. It's a lot harder. You got to be smart. Today's gangster, the acumen, the business acumen, I think is very, very serious. They're not dummies by any stretch of the imagination. But look, you're always going to have drugs. You're always going to have loan sharking. You're going to have bid rigging. But just it really, really comes down to unions too. If you cannot control the unions, you cannot control the work. You cannot control the distribution of things. Unions are everything. Unions are everything. And I think that if you see a guy today that can go into one of these small areas and really fucking work that union and control that union, now you're talking. Now you're talking. All right, let's see where we're at. Do you think Frank Costello was afraid of Vincent Gigante because Thierry set in motion the murder of Bruno? Okay, so here's my thing. No, I don't think he was. And without fear of reprisal from the Gambinos, I really don't think that a lot of stuff would have happened if Carlo Gambino was still in charge at that point. I think that... And Gambino was still in charge at that point. Excuse me. I was thinking ahead of something else. But, look, Costello was in business with the Chin. And the thing is that there was a lot of different stuff going on. And I don't think that Costello was afraid of Gigante because at the end of the day, Gigante's not the one that wanted Costello dead. This is an order that came from Vito Genovese. Vinny the Chin is just doing a job. And it really just came down to... I think Costello just realized that Genovese wasn't going to stop. Genovese had one sort of mode of operation at that point. He successfully got Luciano out of the way, and he was going to take over the crime family at any cost necessary. And so I don't think really it was Costello was afraid of him. I mean, come on, the guy almost got killed, and at that point he sees the writing on the wall that Genovese isn't going to stop. And I think that Costello just said, I've had enough of it. I've had enough of it. I'm not going to outlive my use. I've already outlived my usefulness. And I think that was a mistake in a lot of ways. And the reason why I say that was a mistake is because if you look at the history of Costello, he was really a dignitary of the mob. I mean, he was the guy that put politicians in the pockets of the mob. Once he's sort of thrown out of the way, forget about it. The mob sort of lost control of a lot of unions at that point. Granted, it would go on for another decade or two, but it was never the same. But I would agree that, Costello saw the writing on the wall, and he just wanted to be left alone at that point. And as far as Vinny the Chin goes, it was business. It wasn't personal. And Frank Costello let that shit go. He never blamed Vinny the Chin. He knew that Genovese was behind it. He knew that Vinny the Chin was just doing what he was supposed to do, and that was the end of it. It was about money and prosperity and all that kind of good stuff. But the minute that Vinny the Chin takes a shot, I don't think there's fear of Vinny the Chin. It's fear of Genovese. Genovese, I think, was the guy that... And I don't even know if fear is really the right way of going with it. I really don't. I think it just... Look, these guys don't want me around no more. They took a shot. They didn't kill me. I'm alive. I'm going to step aside and let them do what they want. But the minute that they lost Costello's politicians, it really hurt specifically the Genovese crime family, what would become the Genovese crime family, and it really hurt the New York mob in general. All right, can you possibly do a show on an entire show on the 5 families in New York? I know it's going to be hard to cover every single thing, but just the historical moments with information on the heaviest hitters and bosses. I can try, but, you can only do it so much. I allow myself, usually an hour and a half. I don't want to do a 3-hour show on one entire crime family. But I think if you're going to do, a short historical reference, I think definitely that's something that I could look into. All right. I have a question for you. Why have they not made a movie on Roy DeMeo and his crew killing everybody? I think it would be a huge hit. You have a serial killer and you have made men at the same time. I think it would be a classic. It would be a dark movie. But anyway, just my opinion. And I think it would be a huge hit. And if you were making it, who would you have playing Roy DeMeo? I never understand why Hollywood picks some of the mob genre films that they choose to greenlight. I think a lot of that has to do, and I think a lot of the reason why you haven't seen a film dedicated to Roy DeMeo is because I don't think Roy DeMeo is known in a lot of circles. He may be known to me, he may be known to mob guys, he may be known to hardcore mob genre fans, but the outsider on the street, if you mention to them John Gotti, they're going to know who that is. You mention Al Capone, they're going to know who that is. Meyer Lansky, they might. Roy DeMeo, they're going to have no fucking idea. They're going to have, you even mentioned Lucky Luciano to them, they're going to understand what that means. They're not going to understand who Roy DeMeo is. You could sit down with a bunch of Hollywood executives and say to them, hey, do you know who Roy DeMeo is? And they're going to look at you confused, like you just punched their kitten in the balls. They're not going to get it. They're not going to understand. And the thing is with Hollywood, you have to have big name recognition above all else. John Gotti, Al Capone, Lucky Luciano. Those are the names they're going to focus on. But somebody like Roy DeMeo is going to be unknown to them. But if Hollywood had common sense at least, they would go back to the beginning and highlight the organized crime guys who totally made the mob what it is today. Guys, I would love to see a Luciano film from beginning to end. I think that would be great. But the problem is it's not popular. I think historical films, when's the last time we really saw a historical film based on crime? It's been a long time. Especially when you look at the 20s and 30s. But, I would love to see a historical film that covers the mob in Cuba other than, it's sad, but The Godfather really wasn't a historical film, but they had elements of history involved in that. I'd love to see a film on the Colombo Wars. I would love to see a mob film that just intertwines with history. If you cannot intertwine history, there's no fucking point. But as far as Roy DeMeo, I don't think there's ever going to be a film made about Roy DeMeo. I don't, so for me, it's hard to say who I would pick to play a Roy DeMeo. But I think if you're going to pick an actor to play Roy DeMeo, you got to go completely the opposite of what you would expect, right? So rather than go out and get a short, squat Paul Giamatti, you'd be better off going and getting a Jack Black. And the reason why I say that is usually opposites personality-wise play better going against the grain. And that's just my opinion. I could be wrong, but I think that's the reality of it. But I don't think listen, and I've said this, the mob genre is dead. It's done. Of course, there's a couple of films that I know that are in production and coming out that involve the mob genre. But I think those days are really, really, truly coming to an end. They're not telling original stories. And then they're trying to update it with some stuff. I recently watched Cop Out, which was a movie directed by Kevin Smith with Bruce Willis and Tracy Morgan. And the whole point I'm trying to bring up about this is if you're going to make a cop buddy flick, you think of things like Lethal Weapon. That's a cop buddy flick. They had Latino guys saying Holmes and all this other shit. But obviously, the dipshits, the Coen brothers who wrote that screenplay have never fucking been to New York. Because the Puerto Rican guys, I know they don't talk like that. Holmes is a Mexican thing. These guys weren't Mexican. Or maybe they were trying to play loose Mexicans. But that's the point I'm trying to wrap around this is that people are writing screenplays about things they have no idea about. They're writing about Hispanic organized crime in a way that is stereotyped East LA type of bullshit. There's a huge difference between East LA and fucking Spanish Harlem. Huge difference. And so the thing is that as long as they're going to hire people to write these screenplays and direct these films who have no fucking idea about the streets or the mob, you're not going to get a true mob film, because you're not bringing in anybody. You're bringing in the rats, but you're not bringing in anybody who knows the genre. And the minute the Hollywood or Fox or any of these big studios really goes out and gets people that know the genre, know sort of the reality of the streets, that's when you're going to get a real gut check and a real in-your-face film. Until they do that, it's going to be operatic films like, The Godfather and stuff like that. All right. Here we go. If you had to recast the movie The Irishman with the same main guys, De Niro, Pesci, Pacino, Buffalino, would De Niro, Pesci have been Hoffa? I guess this person's saying that if they were going to recast it, they would have made somebody else Jimmy Hoffa. Here's my point on that film, and I'm tired of talking about the film, but I'll be honest with you. As far as Jimmy Hoffa, I think Jack Nicholson, who was in the movie Hoffa, I think Oliver Stone directed that. That was a better Jimmy Hoffa film. That was a more accurate portrayal of who Jimmy Hoffa was back in the day than what Al Pacino and Martin Scorsese were able to do. It was a lot more historically accurate. I thought that Jack Nicholson's portrayal was a hell of a lot more accurate. Look, I like Al Pacino, but I think Al Pacino sort of played Jimmy Hoffa way too fucking soft, like a nice, laughing, caring family guy. And let's be honest, Jimmy Hoffa was a cursing every other word, fuck. He was a tough guy who never fucking ever backed down from anybody. While I respect Al Pacino for playing it against the grain, I just think you're not being honest to who the character was. Some of the other changes, first of all, Sebastian Maniscalco, that piece of shit, I can't stand that guy. Horrible actor, should never have been involved in the project. There was a lot of acting choices I thought in that film. They were a little fucking weird. But out of all of them, I thought that Joe Pesci, Harvey Keitel, and Ray Romano were the three best actors in that film. I thought Ray Romano was terrific. We're used to seeing Ray Romano in comedies and other stuff. I thought he was great. I thought Joe Pesci played Russell Buffalino exactly the way he should have. I thought Harvey Keitel made a great Angelo Bruno. Everybody else was kind of like stereotyped. I didn't even think De Niro was that good. I'll be honest with you. I know a lot of people don't like De Niro because of his political leanings, but if you're one of these people that can't like a film because of somebody's politics, then, you got more problems than I can think about. But yeah, I thought that that Pesci for the most part was fantastic. Ray Romano and Harvey Keitel. I don't know what changes I would have made. I first of all, there's a lot of things, and I've talked about it on many other shows, and I don't want to go down that fucking rabbit trail today, but there's a lot of things I would have changed about that film to begin with. I think there's a lot of historical references that they did leave out. All right. Here we go. In the movie, The Irishman, once again, another Irishman question. Russell Buffalino sort of answered to Fat Tony Salerno a bit, having to side with him on most things. Was Fat Tony Salerno above him in any way, or were they just good friends and business partners? This is one of the beefs I have with the movie. Buffalino did not answer to Tony Salerno. Russell Buffalino didn't answer to anybody but Russell Buffalino. He was on the commission. Therefore, anybody on the commission got along, made decisions that were best for the Mafia. The fact that he would defer to Tony Salerno at times, sure, I'm sure that happened a lot with the commission. Guys would defer to other guys. What's your opinion? But the idea that Tony Salerno was going to tell Russell Buffalino what to do is bullshit. I don't know why they did it that way in the film. Maybe it was just because Hollywood likes to bastardize the truth, and they wanted to make Russell Buffalino sort of liked in a different kind of way, make him sort of sentimental and emotional, I suppose. And Russell Buffalino, even Tony Salerno was a soft-spoken guy, a very hush-hush guy most of the time anyway, but in no way, shape, or form was Russell Buffalino sort of beholden to Tony Salerno. I think that they made Tony Salerno a bigger fixture in that film, which really wasn't accurate. So there you go. All right. When I was a kid in the 1960s, I was the stick boy for the Long Island Ducks in the Eastern Hockey League. As you know, the movie Slapshot was based on the crazy, bloodiest hockey in history, the 1960s EHL, which was the Eastern Hockey League, and Paul Newman's character was based on the legendary John Brophy, who was the prince of the penalty box. And the Ducks' rivals, the New Haven Blades, Long Island before Brophy became the general manager of the Maple Leafs. I watched him play for many, many years. He was a bona fide psycho on the ice. You're too young, Jeff, to have watched him play, but based on your YouTube favorites, I saw that you were a fan of John Brophy. Can you share with your listeners your favorite John Brophy story? If you don't know who John Brophy was a white-haired, red-faced, Antigonish, Nova Scotia hero, hockey legend, one of the greatest coaches. I believe he has the second winningest record as an NHL coach behind Al Arbor. Brophy was, I believe it's over 5,000 penalty minutes as a player. As a coach, he was suspended several times. He would fight fans. He would fight other players. He was a no-nonsense guy. I do have a hockey background, which I talked a lot about before. But as far as some stories about John Brophy, because I knew John Brophy a little bit. I spent a lot of time with John Brophy. I got a lot of friends that played for John Brophy. I got a lot of friends that played against Brophy, and anybody that ever met the guy. With children, he was quiet, he was reserved, he was nice. Give him a little time, give him a beer, give him a loss, and the amount of sheer F words that would come out of his mouth, he didn't give a fuck about. He was the type of guy that you did not want to fucking piss off for any fucking reason whatsoever. So I think I got a couple of stories. Years ago, I was helping teach sort of a skills lesson with a bunch of kids. They would bring in, former pros and stuff like this to help teach kids skills and stuff like that. So that's what I was doing. And at the time, the Admirals who played in the East Coast Hockey League were using this rink for pre-camp because they couldn't use their arena at the time. So they had come to a local ice rink and they were doing their pre-camp. And one of the things that Brophy would do is he would bring his dogs with him. I think there were three. There was Mud Duck, there was Novi, and there was Scotia. There were nice little dogs and stuff like that. And one of the things that Brophy would do to just totally fucking drive the owner of the rink nuts, who's a guy by the name of Alan Harvey, is he would let the dogs come on the ice. And invariably, the minute the dogs would get on the ice, they would piss and shit on the ice immediately. And Brophy would end up laughing and saying, "Oh, that's for the low fucking pay I'm getting for doing this shit." While he liked Alan Harvey, I think it was more that he just fucking tolerated the guy. But it would always crack me up when the dogs would shit on the ice. Another instance, they were having another kids clinic, and one of the pro players, the guy by the name of Chris Phelps, took a bunch of kids outside for off-ice conditioning. They were doing soccer and some other stuff. And I was inside talking with John Brophy, and we were talking about hockey. And suddenly a guy comes in. He's all irate. He's complaining that one of the kids kicked a soccer ball and it went through the car windshield. And then Chris Phelps started swearing at the guy. And so the guy's sitting here complaining, saying that this player was swearing at him. A soccer ball went through the fucking windshield. And the problem is that Chris Phelps was a born-again Christian. He didn't swear at anybody. He was not that type of guy. He was very polite. Everything was Jesus. And Phelps was the kind of guy that Chris Phelps was a guy that wouldn't even fight on the ice. You could punch him in the face. He wasn't going to fight back. He was just kind of not going to do that. Brophy hears this and looks at me and goes, "Phelps, you don't swear at nobody," in his thick, Nova Scotia accent. And immediately Brophy goes from a pale shade of white to a fucking beet red face. And before he even gets to the door to go outside, he's muttering incoherently, cursing every other fuck. And I knew this was about to get fucking nasty. So Brophy gets outside, and he starts to fucking yell at this fucking guy because the guy went out ahead of him because he wasn't able to get what he wanted out of Brophy. So Brophy follows him outside, and Brophy is continuing to ask him if he wants his fucking skull rearranged in the name of Jesus. Brophy wasn't a guy that was going to hesitate. He was going to fight the guy. And it was an ugly situation that the guy realized. I think he was dealing with John Brophy and just kind of got out of there. Brophy was not the kind of guy that he was infamous for throwing a hacksaw at a hacksaw blade at a fan. He was just a no-nonsense guy. The third story involves, I think it was either Dean Stork or Daryl Shedden. And I don't remember which one of the two guys it was. I could even be wrong, but this is a story that I had heard. But pretty much the Dean Stork or Daryl Shetton had played a really fucking awful period, and during the intermission, I think between the first and second period, Brophy walks over and rips the guy's skates off his own feet and then throws them in the garbage, and he looks at him and says, "You're worthless, and that's where your fucking skates belong, you fucking cocksucker." So basically, he calls the guy a piece of shit, rips off his skates, throws them in the trash. The guy is thrown off the team. That's just the way Brophy was. He had an in-your-face style, a fucking brutal sort of philosophy. He liked guys who would fight. He liked guys who were tough, guys who wouldn't check, guys who wouldn't fight. Did not survive very long, on John Brophy's teams. But I will tell you another thing is in the few 45-minute conversations that I had with John Brophy, I could tell you what, I learned more from him in 45 minutes than any coach I've ever had in my life. And I think it's a shame that he didn't have a longer NHL career as a coach. Listen, NHL guys weren't going to tolerate the brutality of the way he coached. He was probably the smartest hockey person I've ever met in my life, probably the most knowledgeable hockey coach I've ever met in my life. And when he passed away, hockey lost a legend, and I've always felt the NHL should have honored him in some sort of way. I mean, being the second winningest coach in fucking hockey, you should have a plaque. You should have something for that. But because of how Brophy's interactions were with people, that's probably a lot of the reason why they don't. After all, if you go back to the early days of the ECHL Kelly Cup, it was named after Pat Kelly. If you go back to the 70s, it was really, I think it was John Brophy bit off a piece of Pat Kelly's face in a fight and spit it on the ice. So if that tells you the kind of guy that Brophy was, guy was just a fucking legend. All right, on The Sopranos, when Phil decided to take out the Soprano family administration and started taking guys out, why do you think Tony didn't go to the commission? Likely because they didn't have a seat on the commission at that point. I don't know. I don't understand. I think because David Chase wanted the Sopranos to sort of be the it's the minor leagues. He wanted the Sopranos to be the minor leagues of the mob. And that's sort of the way that the curvature of the story arc was with that particular story. And I think that's probably why they didn't. I think they wanted to keep them relatively like suburban mobsters. And I think that was a mistake, but that's what made the show good. All right. Interesting what you said in one of your last shows. Getting made, you said all families had to approve. I didn't know that. Is that still the way it is? A little off topic, but I know outlaw bike clubs are like that. I just didn't know that Cosa Nostra was. I don't know if it was that way say, 1984. I'll be honest with you. I think once sort of John Gotti took over the Gambino crime family, ended, and then once Sammy Gravano kind of did what he did, I think they just sort of let that slide. I know in the early days, that's the way that things were. I know that Tony Salerno was talking at one point about a list being circulated around the crime families of this one being inducted, that one being inducted. And Tony Salerno had no idea who any of them were, and so he tells the guy, go ahead, take the list up to the boss, which would have been Vinny the Chin Gigante at the time. So like I said, in the old days, that's sort of how it went. But these days, I think there's probably a lot less emphasis on that. And so... The books are essentially closed on New York. They have been for a long time, but the books are wide open in other territories. So I think it just depends, but I think the days of shuffling around a list are pretty much over. I think a lot of the crime families are insulating themselves these days. They still work with each other a bit here and there, but I think the days of this captain talking to these two captains from other crime families, while it still happens, I just don't think there's an emphasis on the bosses meeting each other anymore. All right, why did Carlo Gambino not trust Neil as his underboss? I know Neil wasn't happy with the Anastasia hit, so instead of not trusting your underboss for 20 years, why not just kill him? Well, the reason is just like you said, and it went back to the Albert Anastasia hit. Gambino knew that Della Croce, had a strong following. He was a powerful guy. I'm not saying he could have rivaled Carlo Gambino. I don't think he could have. But they didn't trust each other because Gambino knew that sort of Della Croce held his nose at the Anastasia hit. He didn't agree with how it was done. He didn't agree that you should be able to kill a boss and take over. But Neil was also the type of guy that a boss was a boss was a boss, and he was going to fall in line. But I think that Gambino felt that moving against Della Croce because he was an older statesman was going to create a lot more problems than it was worth. And so that's why he just leaves him alone. Because, listen, Della Croce was still a strong ally for Gambino, and it always would be that way. But I think that that's the mistake ultimately that Gambino makes in the end when he allows Paul Castellano to take over. I would rather have 50 Neil Della Croces than 2 John Gottis. I'll be honest with you. That's just the reality of how I see it. But I don't think it benefited him to kill Della Croce, because Della Croce was the guy in the streets that kept everybody in line. Paul Castellano wasn't keeping nobody in line. So that's just the reality of it for me. All right. At his prime, would Stefano Magaddino easily have taken on the 5 families? Probably not. While he had power and allies, Gambino, Lucchese ultimately never would have stood for it. And while power is, having power is a good thing, it's only effective if you use it the right way. Listen, Magaddino wasn't a total barbaric boss. I mean, he was the type of guy who would rather have an agreement than a war. But if he was pressed to strap up, you better fucking believe he's going to kill whoever he fucking needs to. He wasn't an egotist like his nephew Joe Bonanno. He settled with what he had, and he was an old school guy. For instance, look at what Gotti did. Gotti brings the heat on everybody for his actions in his mouth. Whether you agree with that or not, that's the reality of it. It wasn't survival for him. It was ego with Gotti. Gotti wanted to be the boss, so he did, whatever he felt like he had to do. Had Gotti just waited, Castellano ultimately would have gone away for the commission trial, and he could have gone about it differently, but ultimately it is what it is. But no, I don't think Magaddino could have taken on the other 5 families and survived. I'll just be honest with you. All right. I hope this isn't a stupid question. Do you know or think any maid guys would have attended Sonny Franzese's wake and funeral? I can tell you for a fact that there were maid guys that were there. I can tell you that despite Newsweek's article, the FBI was watching that very closely. So listen, there were a lot of old-timers, young guys, but you got to understand something. Sonny Franzese was 103 years old. The guys he grew up with are all gone. Sonny Franzese was a legend. He honored Cosa Nostra from day 1 to day 103. I was told that his son John did not show up. Obviously, John Jr. was an informant. I heard Michael Franzese was there, but also at the same time, Michael Franzese is not very much respected on the streets either. Like I said, we've talked about this before. He ratted out a bunch of people, and that's the reality of it. But it's a funeral. They had 2 wakes. Each wake was 6 hours apiece, so a lot of people went through there. I think there were 300 some people at his funeral service itself. And so I know for a fact a lot of people did go to the wake, but that's just reality. People respect Sonny Franzese. The guy was a legend. They don't make men like him anymore. They absolutely don't. Not many people will tell a judge, I'm going to do all 50 years, you watch, Your Honor, and do it. He did. All right, do gangsters have an exit strategy like was portrayed in the Godfather movies by the Corleone family heads, or in real life do they feel, fuck, this is what it is, who the fuck, this is who we are, etc., etc.? I think guys like Russell Buffalino likely sort of did in their own kind of way. Russell Buffalino took a lot of his money and started getting into legitimate enterprises. But listen, nobody's ever going to give it up. There's too much money. There's too much ego, too much pride. And even if they wanted to, I don't think ego is going to allow them to walk. It's like a child that you raise, right? You wouldn't just walk away from your kid, would you? No. So guys like, Buffalino would relinquish their day-to-day operations and sort of let somebody take over things, but they're still going to get their kickbacks. And Buffalino always remained a voice. So it's really the action, the ego, and the power which keeps guys sort of entrenched. I mean, it's easy for me to say, look, if I made $20 doing this, that, and the third off an illegal enterprise, that would be enough for me. But how much is enough? When is enough enough? And I think that's sort of the reality of organized crime. The second you walk away, guys may still respect you a little bit to some extent, but you don't no longer are feared. You no longer have any juice, and that's why guys don't want to give that up. Was the K&A gang ever as large as the Westies crew? No, absolutely not, and they were nowhere near as deadly either. All right, DeMeo crew versus the Westies. Who'd be left standing? In my opinion, the Westies, and I'm going to tell you why. They were just too dangerous, and the Westies outnumbered the DeMeo crew. While the DeMeo crew was absolutely dangerous, I don't think that they had the same numbers as the Westies. But on the other hand of that, DeMeos also have the entire Mafia on their side. So, so I don't know, if they were pressed to have a war, obviously I don't think the Westies would have fucking won that. But, really Roy DeMeo was the overseer of the Westies anyway. He was put in charge looking over them on behalf of Paul Castellano. All right, can you give comment or insight to the Pittsburgh and Rochester Los Cosa Nostra families in connection? Yes, I am going to do a Rochester show and a Pittsburgh show, and I'm just not going to get into that today. All right, if you could have your own family in Cosa Nostra any era from 1900 to today in any city in the United States, when and where would be ideal in your opinion? This is going to sound crazy, but Maine. I say that because, you're at the tip of the map. You have easy access to Canada, easy access to seaports. I know, look, the weather is brutal in fucking Maine, but if we're going to go back to the early days, being near the seaports, being near the docks, that's more effective. You can control the port, you can control what comes in and what comes out, and especially if you're in that area when Prohibition is going on. If you're involved in Prohibition, forget it, you're going to make a ton of money. Plus, it's a hub to Boston and New York. That's where I would have set up shop. Never mind, you can control the lumber unions and everything else that Maine had going on during those time. All right. The American mob definitely has been more quiet since the publicity and murders, at least of broad day shootings, are less common. Do you believe they could have just gotten smarter so the murders are less necessary just because people have fallen in line other than the rats? And when they do kill, it's properly done, so there's not much evidence or witnesses. Okay, so I guess what this person is asking is, the mob definitely is being a lot more quiet. Is it because they're doing it right, doing it wrong? Well, no, it's because the mob isn't murdering anybody anymore. It's not a matter of too much evidence, not a matter of too many witnesses. It's the fact that there's cameras in every fucking corner. But murder is always necessary. It has to be. If you don't have murder, people run amok. I've always said that the second a murder becomes something people don't fear, then you no longer have the fear of keeping them in line, because that's the ultimate penalty, right? Oh, no, we're going to take your car. All right, big deal. I'll get another car. If we're going to take your fucking life, that's a real threat. And I think we've seen less of it because there are more informants today than ever. It's harder to kill a guy with the cameras on all the corners, like I said. I mean, do you kill a guy because he owes you money? No. I mean, killing a guy who owes you money, the bottom line is your money. You're never going to get your money back that way. So it's easier to crack a guy in the fucking head a couple times with a hammer, and then they get the message. And who's to say murders aren't happening? Guys disappear all the time. I mean, logically, I think if you're going to sentence a guy to death, it has to be for a reason. Guys are more apt today to find proof that a guy is talking rather than clip him. They want that paperwork. They get the paperwork, then they're going to look to clip a motherfucker. Just being accused of it isn't enough these days. Back in the old days, you were even seen talking to a cop. Forget it, you're done. And I can tell you with 100% certainty, mob guys today are up to speed on what's going on. They're no dummies. They can get paperwork on guys without knowing anybody. And they've adapted in ways that really, truly blow my mind. I mean, personally, I think murder is justified in many ways. And those that tell me that murder is never justified, well, let your child get raped or fucking abducted or molested, and you're going to start thinking sideways on that. The sanctity of life doesn't count at all when you decide to get involved in the streets and make stupid mistakes. These guys, when they join, know the fucking penalty. So the argument that I have with people, this is the argument I have with people all the time. I don't justify murder, but at the same time, who are they killing? Themselves. Murder keeps you feared. If people know you will kill them, they will fear you. The minute that you control a fucking group or an organization by fear, then you're going to have guys that aren't going to run. But at the same time, that's why a lot of guys talk shit on Nicky Scarfo and ratted him out because they were afraid of him. You take a guy who people know will kill them. If pushed, most will stay in line. The second you take murder off the table, what do you got left? A beating? Guys are ratting each other out because they won't do a fucking year. I remember the days when a guy would turn, fucking rat because he was going to do 50 years. These guys can't do a year. They can't do 6 months. All right, does the DeCavalcante family have territory outside of Elizabeth and North Jersey? It seems like everybody has a part of their territory. Historically, yes. I mean, they still have a small portion of Newark. They have Florida, parts of Florida, Connecticut, New York, and in Atlantic City. But honestly, I don't know if they still carry any weight in Atlantic City. But I can say this. If the DeCavalcantes were bigger, smarter, and more dangerous, if they could open up more territory. Imagine if they combine with Philly, my friends in Philly. Talk about a serious crime family then. I've always thought it was Philadelphia versus New York in many ways. You put Jersey with Philly combined and you add fringe crews that Philly does have in other states, that's a game changer immediately. Then New York families no longer look at Philly like the little kids club. And Philly is not a little kids club. I don't give a fuck what anybody says. It's always New York assholes. And yes, I'm from New York. I live in New York. But it's always New York assholes that say that. They've never been to Philly. They don't understand the compunction of Philly. They don't understand how South Philly is. And I keep saying it over and over and over again. Philly is absolutely impenetrable. They're strong. They're strong in their core. They're strong family ties, strong morals. But if you merged Philadelphia and New Jersey, it would never work because the egos are too big. I'll just be honest with you. And I think Philly itself is stronger than a lot of people think. I think they're bigger than a lot of people think. They're dedicated to the cause. What are you going to do? All right. What did Sam the Plumber say about Carlo Gambino on Wiretaps? Have you actually heard them? No, I have not heard them, but I saw transcripts. And more or less, while Sam the Plumber was on the commission, I don't think... and I say this with trepidation because while having a commission seat, I think he ended up more or less subservient to Carlo Gambino and others. I mean, if he owned New Jersey outright, right, there would not be others taking his territory. There was a huge influx of the five families into New Jersey, so I mean, it would piss you off, right? Here you are, the boss of Jersey, and you got all these factions taking kickbacks. It's not like Sam the Plumber was going into Boston and New York and telling them what to do. So I think from that description, I think that Sam the Plumber had a little resentment towards New York, and I wouldn't blame him. I don't think many people would. So the transcripts really speak to the ambivalence that he has towards New York. I mean, his stance pretty much ends up being, it's not right with New York all over my turf, but I'm not on their turf. But what could he really do at the end of the day? He couldn't fight them. And in some ways, perhaps it was better to have a smaller area and just be able to expand a bit into Florida, Connecticut, New York without the trappings of going to war. I just think that he felt that Carlo Gambino was greedy in a lot of ways. And I think that he resented the influx of all the other crime families into what he considered his turf. All right. After watching The Irishman, I'm interested in Sally Bugs. What do you know about him? Listen, Sally Bugs, whose real name was Salvatore Bergoglio, he was a no-nonsense guy. The one thing that we have to say is that for a long time the feds thought he was actually the guy that shot and killed Jimmy Hoffa, which more or less leads the FBI to suspect that that's while Sally Bugs was killed. But other reports sort of say that Tony Provenzano, that Sally Bugs was killed not because of the Hoffa thing, but because he was a rat. Tony Provenzano believed that Sally Bugs was a rat, and it's alleged that Sally Bugs was tied to the feds, giving them information on a murder that dated back to 1961 of a union rival. Sally Bugs was a Genovese associate based out of New Jersey. He was an effective loan shark and a hitman for the mob. He was a close associate, like we said, of Tony Pro, especially Local 560. And he was more or less used as Tony Provenzano's weapon of choice. Where Sally Bugs gets his real notoriety comes from is being basically the bulldog of Provenzano. So if Pro needed a guy clipped, Pro needed a guy hurt, it was Sally Bugs that would take care of it. But like I said, there's a lot of reports out there that he was giving information on guys to other people. All right. I watched an episode of the FBI Files. The title was, I believe, entitled Mississippi Burning in the Real Story. They didn't mention Greg Scarpa. Was Scarpa involved in a different case in this, or was it that the FBI did not want to mention the Grim Reaper in this? Thank you. Look, Greg Scarpa had nothing to do with Mississippi burning whatsoever. The story was spun by his former wife, and there's no factual information that substantiate those claims. Scarpa's ex-wife, ex-girlfriend, whatever the fuck she was, made up a lot of bullshit that was never true. And Scarpa's story has a long history of being a big fish story. While Greg was notorious, and nobody's debating that, and deadly, all these crazy claims about Scarpa are nonsense as far as I'm concerned. The story was that Greg Scarpa was recruited by the FBI to go to Mississippi to extract information about 3 missing students. It's alleged that Scarpa was given pretty much carte blanche to do whatever he needed to do physically to get the information. It's also alleged that Greg Scarpa kidnapped a Klansman and used his expert torture techniques to get information out of them. The problem is none of that's true. It was actually a highway patrolman named Maynard King who actually went to the feds and told them where the bodies were located, and he got the information from a third party, which was a snitch within the Ku Klux Klan. So that completely refutes the Greg Scarpa tale. Then there's other things where it was alleged that Greg Scarpa went back to Mississippi to work on a murder case which involved Vernon Dahmer, no relation to Jeffrey Dahmer. Dahmer had been killed and set on fire by the Ku Klux Klan. I don't believe any of that story either. Why would the FBI use Greg Scarpa? They had CIA guys that could have done that in covert operations. These were guys that wanted to kill Martin Luther King. They framed James Earl Ray for that hit. So while it's a good story, I don't believe any of it, and there's nothing to prove that's accurate. All right, are the Westies still active? I saw an article about crime in Hell's Kitchen, and names like Comiskey, Bocoon, and Coonan popped up. Is Jimmy Coonan involved behind bars? No, Jimmy Coonan is not involved, and the Westies are still active, but they're not what they once were. Jimmy's nephew, John Coonan, is involved loosely, from what I understand, and active Kenny Shannon, Johnny Halo, Tommy Collins, Muggsy Ritter. Jason Coonan, who's also a nephew, is also involved. But like I said, those are just the names the FBI puts out. I really don't know how accurate those tend to be. All right. Do the Bonanos still have a visible or a viable presence in Montreal? Are they still tight with the Rizzutos after the murder of Sal Montagna? They do have a presence, but not much. The Rizzutos and the Bonanos effectively pretty much split after what Joey Massino did. Created a lot of problems. The Bonanos don't have the family tie with the Rizzutos that they used to. It started back then, and from what I understand, while there are some loose associations, the Bonanos lost most of what they had in Montreal as a result of the Joey Massino thing. All right. The most gruesome hit, I think, is the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, hands down. I agree that that's one of the nastier ones, but most of what the Mayo crew... Okay. This person seems to think the Valentine's Day Massacre was probably the most gruesome mob hit ever, but I don't... You know what? Well, I agree with that, but most of what the DeMeo crew did trumps anything that happened on St. Valentine's Day, because the sheer brutality of what DeMeo crew did. I mean, look, it's one thing to kill like 16 guys posing as police with a fucking machine gun. It's another when you hang them upside down in a fucking bathroom, then you fucking dissect them on a tarp while eating a slice of pepperoni pizza. To me, that's a little more brutal. You know what I mean? All right. Was the Dallas crime family involved in the Kennedy hit at all? If not, why do you think they were not tapped for that? They weren't. And it's likely because they wanted to use guys without of the range of the killing. If they had used Dallas in that sense, that would have created problems because it would have been too easily tied. And Dallas at the time was pretty much done. While they still had guys there, they were no longer the powerhouse. They were never really a powerhouse to begin with, but a lot of the strength that they did have was gone. They didn't have any political power either at the time. So, I mean, I think it's a job that's facilitated by a lot of people, including the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service. I just don't think you shit in your backyard, as they say. This is why we've seen, like, the Genovese crime family use other family for hits. This is why we've seen Italian organized crime use the Crips and the Bloods, which is a huge mistake. But that's what they do, because you never use your own family to hit your own family, and they subcontract a lot of things out. All right. Here we go. Have you read the book, The Sixth Family on the Rizzuto Crime Family? If so, what did you think? I haven't read the book, but I do think that there is some validity in saying that the Rizzutos easily could have made a sixth family. Not today, but back in the day, absolutely. All right. This is the question I was avoiding. I wanted to avoid, but I'm not. I'm going to address it once, and this is the last time I'm ever going to address it. How come you used to be pro Gotti and now you take every opportunity to knock them? First of all, I do not take every opportunity to knock them. That's number one. Number two, calling me pro Gotti is not really the case. Listen, I've said this once. I'll say it again. I will defend anybody if I think that they've been wrongly accused of something. I will defend somebody if I think they didn't do what people are levying against them. That being said, the one thing that I fucking do, okay, because I did talk at length about Sammy Gravano on one of the other shows. And some people have claimed that I said good things about him. First of all, Sammy Gravano killed a friend of mine's brother when he was 16 years old. I think Gravano's a piece of shit. But at the same time, you also have to think objectively. One thing that I try to do on my show that I will continue to fucking do is I play the middle. I will give you the pros of John Gotti Sr. I will give you the cons of John Gotti Sr. Who the fuck would I be if I'm going to give you a street perspective and not tell you that John Gotti Sr. didn't have a big mouth? I think that that's proven fact that he did. Who would I be to say that the FBI might not gone as far after the Gambinos as they did if John Gotti didn't thumb his fucking nose at them? How much notoriety and publicity did the Gambino crime family get? How much did the FBI have a hard on because John Gotti Jr. or John Gotti Sr. kept having guys show up on Wednesday nights who were all fucking videotaped in front of the Ravenite Social Club because he wanted the mob to be seen? When you do things like that and your ego allows you to do things like that, it creates problems. And those problems lead to other problems. Now, does that justify what Sammy Gravano did? No, not in any stretch of the fucking imagination. But it doesn't make me pro Gotti, doesn't make me anti Gotti. It just makes me fucking telling it like it is. People are very fucking blinded, and I don't care if the Gotti supporters don't like what I'm about to fucking say. John Gotti was not Al Capone. John Gotti was not Lucky Luciano. John Gotti had a fucking 5.5-year fucking run. When you compare that to Ray Patriarca or to Russell Buffalino, you can't even put them in the same fucking category. John Gotti was not any of them. John Gotti was a tough guy. John Gotti was a fucking gangster, but John Gotti didn't have enough intelligence to run his crime family the way it should have been run. He didn't learn from fucking Anastasia. He didn't learn from other bosses, and that's a part of the problem when you have a hostile takeover. When you have a hostile takeover and a motherfucker takes on a fucking corporation and doesn't know how to run it, that's a fucking problem. So does that make Gotti a fucking horrible boss in every fucking sense? No. But let's be realistic and talk about what a boss is. Carlo Gambino was a fucking boss. You know, and so when people come at me and they try to say that I'm somehow being disparaging of the Gottis and I was always talking for them, I have said positive things about them. I've said negative things about them. I used to say positive things about John Gotti Jr. Now I don't fucking say anything at all. The reality is sometimes in life when you're just starting out doing something, you got to play all sides of the fence, and I have done that. And I think anybody that's listened to my show from day one will tell you the guy has been all over the place. He plays all sides. Of course, I've got to, right? But now that I'm established and my show is established, you know, and two, the other thing too is after a long time, you start to have a change of opinion on people. Maybe you met somebody and they're a fucking jerk off, and that's why your opinion changes. Or maybe you read more court documents and you start to see it in a different way. I'm not allowed to fucking have a change of opinion? Come on, please. I'm allowed to change my opinion on people. John Gotti Sr. was the boss of the Gambino crime family for a very, very short period of time. The Gottis the Gambinos in a relatively short period of time when Gotti did take over, made a lot more fucking money. That's the truth. But look at the end result. Look at the end result of that. He gets caught on 1 million fucking wiretaps talking about every kind of fucking murder, and he ends up where he should have. And that's unfortunate. Nobody should ever have to die of fucking cancer chained to a prison bed. Nobody should ever have to suffer that way. But that is the reality of who you are. It's a shame. It's not right. But that's reality. Your mouth gets you in trouble. It's gotten me in trouble my whole fucking life. You would think I would learn. Nope. So it's not that I'm pro. It's not that I'm anti. I'm not anti-John Gotti Sr., and I'm not pro-John Gotti Sr. I will talk about the good things he's done, the bad things he does or had done, and everything in between, because I'm being honest. I'm giving an honest dissertation on who I think the man was. What are we going to do? Talk about all his murders and not talk about him getting caught on a fucking wiretap? Please. You got to be honest. You got to be fruitful with everything. And that's the reality. But a lot of people don't like that. They want you to be all for something. And half the people that are all for something don't know anything about the fucking man. They don't know anything about the streets. They don't know anything about the things that happened. And so they're jaded because it's a folk hero status, and I get it. But the reality is I'm doing you a disservice if I lie to you. I'm doing you a disservice if I don't tell the fucking truth or if I don't give you my honest opinion. And not everybody's going to like my opinion. So it's not pro, it's not anti, it's just reality. All right, why did they toss Johnny Roselli into a barrel in the bay? Well, I mean, you know what? I guess, yeah, sure. Would it have been easier to just dig a fucking hole? Sure, absolutely. But, you know, who knows why they do what they do. All right. Can you still be very rich and wealthy in the American mob? Seems like they can't get away with anything anymore. There's always a trial. There's lawyers. There are prisons. Sure, you can still be rich, you can still be wealthy, but you also have to know what your shelf life is. And if you don't know what your shelf life is, then that's a fucking problem. And you got to legitimize yourself. There is somebody that I know, and I'm not going to mention names here, but there's somebody I know that the feds have alleged is a higher up in the mob, okay? But this particular person has legitimized himself in a lot of legitimate enterprises, a lot of legitimate companies, and that's what you have to do. To make it work. And you know, that's just the reality. If you continuously turn over money, you can't launder it, you can't have a legitimate business, you're going to end up where everybody else ends up, and that's the truth. Let the government, it's their fucking duty and their fucking diligence, those bastards, to prove that you're making illegal money. Make them prove it. Make it hard for them to prove that. There you go. All right, are the Camorra and Cosa Nostra at war in Italy over turf, and can the Camorra handle their own if they go to war with Cosa Nostra? I don't think so, because 'Ndrangheta really is bigger than any other group right now that's over there. And the Camorra, while strong, you know, it's a tough say because there's so many different clans and there's so many different fringe groups. I just don't know if the Camorra on its own could take on all of Cosa Nostra, you know? All right. What do you think of Curtis Sliwa? I don't know Curtis. I know that he's had a history of lying. I know that he self-grandizes. In my opinion, he's a Polish piece of shit, a big mouth and a liar. But there is this side of me that says that if three guys are going to shoot you because of your fucking mouth, sort of you have that coming. But, I mean, I don't know. First of all, the Guardian Angels are a fucking joke. A lot of this is just for view. A lot of this is just for public perception. They really don't do shit. They never have done shit. Curtis Sliwa is all about Curtis Sliwa. And you know, guys get shot who run their mouth completely like that all the time, and that's what happened to him. And it, you know, it is what it is. I don't know the guy personally, never fucking met him. But from all accounts, to anybody I've ever met that has met him, said he's a piece of shit. So there you go. I tend to believe what 15 people say versus one. All right, couple more questions. Who made Sonny Franzese? I know he was in the crew of Buster Alloy. You know, there's several stories. He told people that he was made at 14, which I don't believe, but by all accounts, he was made in 1950, and he would have been proposed for membership by Sebastian Alloy, which would have come at the direct acceptance of Joe Profaci. So I think that that's safe to say is probably the way it went down. Was Richard Kuklinski a hitman? Absolutely not. I have talked at length about Richard Kuklinski. He was a serial killer, and that's the end of it. All right, is the Yakuza financially better now than the Five Families, say 1950s, early 1980s, given making money and through technology these days? Okay, well, look at Shinobu Tsukasa, for example. He's the leader of the Yamaguchi Gumi. He by himself is making $80 billion. I mean, and that's based on the Yamaguchi having 23,000 members, too. So the Five Families don't have anywhere near those numbers, but I'd suspect based on that, the mob back in the day, probably 50s, made a lot more money than the Yakuza. But in comparison to the 50s, 80s, however, when you sort of apply today's rackets and inflation, I think the Yakuza really is killing it financially. I mean, look, the Yakuza are using drones to kill each other. I mean, if that's not technology at work, I don't know what the fuck it is. But, yeah, I don't know. I'll be honest with you. I don't know a lot about the Yakuza. or anything like that. But they're a tough group, and they're making a lot of fucking money. All right. Okay, 2 more questions. Do families use hitmen or do they hire from outside? We sort of kind of talked about that earlier. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. These days, guys aren't killing anybody. And as we see a lot nowadays, they're hiring outside fringe groups, the Bloods, the Crips, to kind of handle that business. So that is what it is. Okay. I don't know. I did not know till a few days ago that Lucky Luciano ratted on some other people. Is that correct? If so, seeing that your stance is a rat is a rat is a rat, do you put Luciano in the same group of rats as Sammy Gravano and Michael Franzese? And does this tarnish his standing in the mob in your eyes? If not, why? All right. So ratting is a very loose term when we're talking about Lucky Luciano. And I say that because everybody at the time was dropping information on each other. Genovese dropped a dime on Luciano. Luciano, in turn, dropped a dime on Genovese. Costello, in turn, dropped a dime on Genovese for the attempted murder of his life. So it seems like in those days, they'd feed crooked cops information, which would lead to a domino effect of indictments and etc. So there's a big difference between using cops to do your dirty work versus today when guys take the stand, they give up information, and they get no prison as a result. There's a big... So is it a rat move? I mean, look, it's a good argument, but the fact is, telling on somebody for profit... versus a reduction, they're both kind of rat moves, but when you consider that everybody in those days was doing it, Gambino, Lucchese, they were all doing it. So it's not like one was doing it over another, but I think there's a big difference between going to a dirty cop and saying, there's going to be a shipment X, Y, and Z. It's going to be good for your political career. It's going to be good for your law enforcement career. And that takes one of my enemies off the streets. There is a difference between doing that, which is what Luciano did, versus going and sitting on a stand and testifying against somebody to get out of jail. Luciano didn't do these things to get out of jail. Gambino didn't do these things to get out of jail. Costello didn't do it to get it out of jail. They did it out of revenge. So to me, it's a different time period. There's a different argument. So what say you? That's a good question to ask the listeners. How do you view that? Do you view what Luciano did, dropping a dime on Genovese, or Costello dropping a dime on Genovese and telling somebody in law enforcement or with the government that was wrong? Does that make them a rat? Are there circumstances which can mitigate that? To me, in my personal opinion, going to a cop and telling them shit on somebody else to get an advantage is a rat move. But if it was good enough for Gambino, it was good enough for all these other guys who historically did that against each other. I think there's a difference between that and getting on a stand. I'll just be honest with you. There's a huge fucking difference in my opinion. All right, so with that, that's going to be all the questions for today. If I didn't get to your question, believe me, I will. It's on the list. And just keep submitting them. Eventually, I will get to them, I promise. We are going to take a break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about Joe Morello and the Morello Mafia, and we're also going to talk about how the Mafia even began, because I think a lot of people don't even understand how the mob began, and I think it's an important lesson in history, and it's called the Sicilian Vespers. We'll be back on Mob Talk Radio. And welcome back to Mob Talk Radio. We are going to be talking about the origins of the Genovese crime family, which obviously started with Giuseppe Morello. But before we do that, I don't often get questions revolving around how the Mafia really even began and what the genesis or the genealogy of that is. And I think it's important that we understand sort of where that came from. Now, I'm going to talk about what's called the Sicilian Vespers. And, of course, there's going to be a historical jerk-off that is going to sort of come at me with this, because I'm not going to say, I could talk about the Vespers for the next 10 fucking years on this show. But I'm going to give you a quick synopsis of it so that we understand how the Mafia began. Because I think you have to understand the genesis or the root cause of how it even began. And the genesis of this goes back to the Easter of 1282. Charles I, who was French-born, had ruled the Kingdom of Sicily since 1266. Charles I ended up taking over as the head of Sicily, and the way he sort of handled business was not to benefit the Sicilians, but just rather himself. The nobility in Sicily really had no share in the wealth that Charles was accumulating, and were not compensated by not being compensated at all for anything. Even though nobility was sent abroad to other countries to help Charles sustain his power. And rather, what Charles would do is he would use the Neapolitan subjects and French subjects rather than Sicilian people themselves. He would heavily tax the Sicilians, and he would tax them on wars funded to take place outside of Sicily, which essentially meant that Sicilians' hard-earned money was being used to surplus Charles's conquests and what he needed. It boiled down to their money was basically going to Charles for him to have a far greater rule over his subjects, and it didn't benefit, it didn't benefit the Sicilians, didn't benefit the country, didn't benefit the island whatsoever. And the Sicilians hated the French, they hated Charles, and it would take one night for all of that to change. And basically what happened was that one of the things the French were actively doing was raping women, stealing, and pretty much doing whatever they wanted to whoever they wanted to without any oversight. On March 30th of 1282 at the Church of the Holy Spirit, which was just outside Palermo, the Sicilians were celebrating Easter, and the French officials arrived and sort of began to party it up with everybody. A sergeant in that group pretty much essentially and practically, for all intents and purposes, raped a married Sicilian woman. Her husband ends up going berserk, and he ends up stabbing the sergeant to death with a knife. When other Frenchmen tried to help out the fallen sergeant, they were swiftly killed by the crowd. Within 6 weeks of the Sicilian uprising, thousands of the French would be massacred. The Sicilians had had enough, and what they would do is begin to organize, and they wanted to put an effort and an end to the war before the French could actually rebound. The rebels would band together, and they would take over the island within a few weeks. Only Messina sort of remained, but the rebels would then set fire to all of Charles's ship in the port, which basically disabled him. And they also wanted to, in a lot of ways, just be recognized as their own country. And a lot of we can sort of attribute that to the way that the Scottish rebels wanted to be free from England's rule. The rebels would go to Pope Martin IV, and they would make a proclamation that each city should be recognized as a free society and basically be only under the Holy Church. And they wanted to be treated like Pisa, like Genoa, like Venice, and they wanted to form their own governments, but they only wanted to be answerable to one person, that being the Pope. The problem was the Pope was French-backed, and he pretty much told them that whatever they wanted to do, they couldn't do, and they needed to recognize Charles as their rightful king. What the Pope didn't understand was that the anger of the Sicilians was beyond what he could control. The Sicilians didn't like Charles for a lot of different reasons. The fact that Charles ran with impunity, overtaxing, rape, pillage, and plunder without oversight, and the fact that a handful of people were wealthy and everyone else was starving was a huge problem. The event which took place is obviously called the Sicilian Vespers, and you can go out on Google and research everything for yourself. Otherwise, I'll be here all day. But this is what historians call the early rising of the Mafia, people banding together in small criminal groups to overthrow the king and the Pope. But the Mafia also has its origins elsewhere. And these small rebel bandit groups would be ultimately called clans. In the 19th century, small private armies would be used, and ultimately they end up being called the Mafia. Sicily would begin its transition from feudalism to capitalism. And under feudalism, the nobles who owned most of the land would enforce their laws and containing their land through small armies, which would in turn protect those lands at a cost. In 1812, feudal barons would begin to sell off or rent their lands to private citizens. Eventually, that would be abolished and land would no longer be seized to settle debts. 1/5 of those lands would become private property of the peasants. In 1860, Sicily would be annexed and large amounts of public land and church land would be distributed to citizens. That creates a problem. The results was basically a huge increase for landowners from, say, 2,000 in 1812 to about 20,000 by 1861. With increased property, owners and commerce, it would lead to massive disputes. Contracts became harder to fulfill and they needed reinforcing. And properties just needed to be protection in general. The barons would unleash their small private armies in favor of the state's rule. The problem was that there were not enough police on the island, and people would begin to commit crimes to survive. Property owners, seeing the problems, would turn to these small band of groups to arbitrate and mitigate problems, albeit illegally. This would really be the initial formation of what we know today as the Mafia. These small groups would oversee price gouging, shake down payments from landowners. They could hunt down thieves and negotiate returns of stolen property and goods, meanwhile collecting a fee from the landowners and the victims themselves. Its first known ordinance, or organization, if you will, would be the protection racket. They would then begin to recruit younger males to join the cause. It's not until really 1864 when Niccolo Colonna, who was the leader of the National Guard, wrote papers on a sect of thieves that were operating throughout Sicily. This is the first known mention of the mob. He wrote they were smugglers, thieves, and cattle rustlers. This sect that he said they offered protection, collected money off protection. They didn't seem to fear public bodies because the members of this sect thought that they could operate around the law without impunity. This group also had a code of loyalty and non-interaction with police known as omerta. It's not till 1865 that they were given the official name of the Mafia. It was soon after that this sect began to meddle in politics. This group would basically bully voters into voting for candidates that they favored. At the current time in Sicily, only a portion of wealthy Sicilians could vote, so no sect boss or mob boss could control huge portions of the election without doing this, and they could wield political leverage. In 1898, it's alleged that this sect, was governed by 8 clans, 8 groups with over 700 members. A report would come out by the police chief of Palermo. His name is Ermanno Sangiorgi. He would explain that the initiation rites and the conduct within these groups. He also exposed their criminal activities as being counterfeiting, kidnapping for ransom, robbery, witness intimidation, and murder. He also acknowledged that a bulk of the money that these groups acquired would be used to support families of imprisoned members, to pay lawyers and help out the family. Today, it's said that there are over 5,000 members of the Mafia in Italy, with over 100 families in the city of Palermo alone. So that's how the Mafia got its start. And obviously, they would bring these values and these beliefs into our country, the United States. All right, so the Morello crime family and Giuseppe Morello. We all know that the Morello crime family would ultimately become known as the Genovese crime family. But how did they get there? The true founder of the Genovese crime family's name was Giuseppe Morello. He was also known as the Old Fox and the Clutch Hand. He was called the Clutch Hand because he had a deformed, like, lobster claw hand. I don't know any other fucking way to really say it, but that's where he got it. Giuseppe Morello was born in 1867 in Corleone, Sicily. For the sake of genealogy, we have to know sort of how Morello arrives here in America. His mother, Angelina, was widowed when Giuseppe's father, Calogero, died, and she would go on to marry Bernardo Terranova. Now, we all know who the Terranovas are. If you want to know who the Terranovas are, you can simply type in Mob Talk Radio, Ciro Terranova, Nick Terranova, and I did a whole entire show on them. Bernardo Terranova was a member of the Corleonesi, which basically is the Corleone Mafia, perhaps more made infamous by the film The Godfather. Giuseppe's mother would go on to have 7 children with Bernardo, including Vincent I, Vincent II, Ciro, Niccolo, Lucia, Rosalia, and Salvatore. it was Bernardo who brought his sons into the mob. It was Giuseppe, according to legend. He was inducted in the Corleone crime family at a very, very young age. Giuseppe's uncle, Giuseppe Battaglia, was actually a local boss of the Sicilian Mafia. In 1892, Morello sort of has a serious problem in Italy. He was named as a suspect in a murder, and the exact circumstances surrounding that murder was that Morello was involved in a counterfeiting ring at the time. One of those involved had began talking to authorities, and Morello, in an act of revenge, kills the person who was talking. In 1894, charges against Morello would go to the courts, but Morello didn't show up, and instead he went to his uncle, Joe Battaglia, and Battaglia ends up smuggling Morello out of the country. Morello would still be found guilty of the counterfeiting and would be sentenced to 6 years in prison via absentia, which means he didn't show up. The exact date of Morello's arrival into New York isn't precisely exactly known, but it's widely assumed he left just prior to the court case and his family would follow behind him just a few months later. Not much is known about the first few years that Morello spent in New York City, but he did end up leaving for Louisiana in the mid-1890s to search for better job opportunities, and his family would end up following them there. He would stay in Louisiana for a year and a half or so, and then he would leave for Texas, where they worked on a cotton farm. New members of the family would end up contracting malaria, and that led them to move back east to New York City in 1897. Now, once back in New York City, Giuseppe Morello would use Mafia money brought with the family to this country to open a few businesses. And he made small investments into other companies, and pretty much everything he attempted to do, at least financially from an investment point of view, would fail. Eventually, Morello would settle into criminality and would use the power of his family to shake down a bar on 8th and Prince Street in Manhattan. The owner of that establishment refused to sell out to Morello, so Morello took a hammer, entered the bar, and pretty much with the swift whack of a hammer a couple hundred times or whatever the case may have been, he forces the owner out. It was shortly after taking over that bar that he would form the 107th Street Mob. The 107th Street Mob were essentially pickpockets, burglars, shakedowns, prostitution ring. Some members of that gang included Tommy Lucchese, Lucky Luciano, and others. They would end up setting up shop and would operate out of East Harlem in the East Bronx. In 1903, they would gain a powerhouse in Ignazio the Wolf Lupo, who would end up marrying Morello's sister Salvatrice, which formed that bond. Ignazio was the de facto leader of the Black Hand in Little Italy and Manhattan. Lupo pretty much controlled extortion, loan sharking, and more. With the blood ties secure, Lupo would join forces with Morello and the Black Hand, forming what was to be known as the Morello crime family, and would establish the South Bronx and East Harlem as the base of operations for the family. That connection would essentially make them the ruling, governing body of all of the mob in New York City. So Morello establishes his reputation early on by killing anybody who will define him. Anybody that told him to fuck off and wouldn't do what he wanted them to do, he would kill them. Lupo would end up taking a backseat to Morello, acting as his top enforcer and underboss. And it's also been alleged that Lupo himself sort of did a Sonny Franzese and whacked over 60-some people in a 10-year period on his own. Lupo would maintain his base in Little Italy, while Morello focused on the Bronx and Harlem, and it's still territory that's owned by the Genovese crime family even today. Lupo and Morello would agree to essentially share in profits, turf, and in effect, they pretty much merged the Morellos with the Black Hand, like I said, making them a true powerhouse. The family pretty much was the first crime family to employ mob tactics and rackets in the city. They used extortion from the old country as well as loan sharking, the numbers racket, robbery, and counterfeiting. They would use illegal funds to create legitimate businesses such as bars, restaurants, clothing stores, and pharmacies. They would also begin to import and export Italian goods, so they were completely legitimizing themselves. They were the first crime family to organize money laundering. They brought over the idea of the protection rackets from Italy and then would shake down every storefront in the area for a small fee offering protection. Morello believed in the protection racket full-heartedly. He didn't want to bankrupt small business owners in the area, so he felt that shaking them down to the point of ruining them was not in everybody's best interest. And so what he essentially did is, like I said, he would collect enough to make a profit and keep them all protected, and everybody gave up money to him. And it allowed these owners of establishments to still make money and not have problems with deliveries and etc. Anyone who didn't comply would either be beaten half to death, their businesses would be torched, or in 3 particular cases, the left hands were chopped off of people who did not acquiesce to what Morello wanted. Most store owners got pretty much on the Morello plan and paid. The move made millions for the family. It's worth also noting that Joe Massaria and Salvatore D'Aquila were captains in the Morello crime family. The one thing that Morello is specifically known for, besides his rackets, are the methods of killing people who did not get in line. Morello understood from a very young age that a body was a bad thing, and he really was the first Roy DeMeo with the Mafia. He would have somebody killed, he would have them dismembered, and he would place them into barrels. The barrels would then be transported to ships on the docks in Brooklyn, and the barrels would either be dumped at sea. He never, ever put the head or hands in the same barrels. If they didn't, put the barrels into the ocean, they would drop them in a secluded corner of the city, a back alley, or even ship to a business address in the city which didn't even exist. Or in some cases, they would even send the barrels to other cities and states. In one particular case, Morello had Benny Madonia hit. Madonia had done really nothing wrong. He was the brother-in-law of somebody who was an actual police informant. Morello wouldn't tolerate anybody that was related to anybody being a snitch, so he would have him killed, tortured for days before dismembering him, putting him in a barrel, which was left on the street for everybody to see as an early warning sign of what Morello would tolerate and what he wanted. It basically was a statement that if anybody talks, they're going to die. So Morello, Lupo, and Tommaso Petto would end up being arrested for that actual murder after they were found having possessions that personally belonged to Madonia. While the case was strong, as in anything else, witnesses began to disappear or would change their version of events, and charges would eventually be dropped on Morello. By 1905, Morello had become one of the biggest criminals in the city, running the biggest crime family in the city. The power he wielded, in fact, made him basically capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. In 1910, Morello gets caught counterfeiting. Morello had a scheme where $5 bills were being counterfeited and sent from Sicily back to New York City, and pretty much Morello was using them absolutely everywhere. The counterfeiting ring was fucking massive, and Lupo and Morello would actually be arrested, charged, and convicted and sentenced to 25 to 30 years, respectively, for that counterfeiting thing, but it would not last, as President Warren G. Harding would actually be bribed by Morello and would actually give him a full pardon. But prior to Morello getting released, his half-brother Niccolo Terranova ends up handling business for the mob. Nick was known as a visionary in many ways, as he truly had the idea prior to Lucky Luciano about forming a commission or a board to handle beef and contracts. And it was basically the simplest form of the commission in its sense. And he actually had the idea and wanted to do that prior to Luciano ever doing it. Nick knew, as Luciano did, that they all needed to work together to make a profit. The thing is, with Lupo and Morello in prison, other groups felt that the Morello crime family was incredibly vulnerable. Enemies thought that Nick lacked the brutality and the intelligence of his brother and saw him as weak. They also saw it as the time to try and take over. And what ends up happening is the Camorra would begin to expand their power base in New York. The Camorra were not like the Sicilians, and they didn't like the Sicilians. The Camorra didn't use a hierarchy structure like the Sicilians, and they would begin killing members of the Morello crime family and would also begin moving into their territories. So between 1915 and 1917, Cosa Nostra, or the Sicilian Mafia, would begin to take on the Camorra, and it basically would be the Morellos versus the Camorra. And in its simplest terms, the Sicilians versus Naples and Campania. The Camorra at the time had a stranglehold on Brooklyn and Coney Island. And basically the war gets going with the murder of Joe Gallucci, who at the time was the boss of Little Italy, or at least, and also the boss of the Camorra as well. Gallucci and his son end up getting killed. The Camorra had several bosses, but it was all overseen by a guy by the name of Andrea Ricci. And so they would have tiny little bosses in different sections of Brooklyn, but ultimately the head of the whole entire Camorra was Andrea Ricci. They were big on Navy Street in Brooklyn, Leopoldo Laurentano and Alessandro Valero, at Gallucci in Manhattan, Pellegrino Morano and Coney Island. So they were very, very strong. So, like I said, the war was pretty much sparked by murder, but it really came down to greed. The thing that bothered the Camorra was that Morello was further encroaching into Manhattan, which they felt that certain portions of that belonged to them. At the end of the day, the Morellos wanted to control gambling completely. The two in charge of gambling on behalf of the Camorra was the Delgadio brothers. Not only did they control gambling in Manhattan, but also in East Harlem. The Morellos would end up striking first, killing the Delgadio brothers. The next step was to ensure that spillover gambling establishments were taken over. Joe DeMarco was in control of gambling joints in Lower Manhattan, and Joe DeMarco was familiar with the Morellos and would end up surviving multiple attempts on his life. He, in turn, would try to kill Nick Terranova, who then was going by Nick Morello. The Morellos would go into Coney Island, and they would end up seeking help from the Navy Street gang and the Coney Island crew, which was actually the Camorra at the time. They were trying to put a stop to the murders. There would be a meeting that would be set up for June 24th of 1916. The Morellos would arrive. They would sit down with the Coney Island crew and the Navy Street crew. The Morellos wanted DeMarco gone. It was good for business. Let's get rid of him. We'll split the profits, and everything will be good. They discussed narcotics, extortion, gambling, and the Joe DeMarco problem. Nick would end up finishing the meeting by asking for the head of DeMarco on a plate, which everyone agrees to in principle. 3 weeks later, Nick Terranova, Ciro Terranova, and Steve LaSalle and Joe Verrazano meet with a faction in Brooklyn to discuss the impending hit. The problem is that DeMarco knew the entire Morello crime family, knew how they operated, and because he knew them, the Morellos knew it would not be easy to hit him. He was way too cautious. Verrazano knew DeMarco very well and knew friends of his, and so what they wanted to do is bring Verrazano in to set up DeMarco. The plan was very basic. Verrazano would hire a hitman, take him to DeMarco's gambling den, point out who DeMarco is, and the hitman would just kill him, and that would solve all the problems. So the first attempt on DeMarco's life didn't go very well. They hired a hitman named John Fetto, and John Fetto ends up showing up late, and DeMarco had already left for the night. The second attempt on him was not much better. They would end up finding out that DeMarco was traveling with Joe Nazzaro and didn't want to risk that. So what they would do is add a second hitman named John Esposito. Esposito and Fetto would enter the bar off Elizabeth Street. They would meet. They would talk about it. And basically the job is to await a certain nod from Verrazano, who would take them there, and then everything would sort of transpire. So at 5 p.m., Verrazano enters the bar, sits down, and explains to them that he would let them know who DeMarco was, and he would take them there, and they would take care of business. So Esposito, Verrazano, and Fetto end up walking over to the gambling hall. Nick Sassy, who was the front man for DeMarco and stood outside the club, pretty much bypassed everything, was in on it, and let them walk into the gambling den. They would walk over to the table, they sat down, and they saw DeMarco. The problem was, the plan was Esposito was supposed to pull out the gun and fucking kill somebody. The problem is that Esposito reads the sign wrong and thinks that Charles Lombardi, who was also sitting at the table, thought that he was Joe DeMarco, and so he ends up killing Lombardi. So chaos ensues, but Verrazano ends up doing the right thing, grabs a gun, and ends up whacking DeMarco. Probably not the best hit ever committed. With the death of DeMarco, the Morellos would end up taking over Lower Manhattan. Not to be outdone, and probably to avoid a monopoly on the gambling racket, the Camorra, who helped kill DeMarco to begin with, begins opening gambling joints in the same sort of area in competition, which ends up infuriating the Morellos. The Morellos absolutely are furious at this point. War is going to start, and they weren't going to take a backseat to the Camorra, essentially from the Camorra's point of view, they felt that a 50-50 split was fair considering they allowed the hit to go down, but the Morellos weren't going to give in. And as a result, the Camorra ends up going down to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania for a meeting. And at the meeting, the Navy crew meets with Andrea Ricci. And they basically meet and they talk about the Morellos sort of encroaching, not being fair, not allowing a split. And so they decide that they are going to basically take it to the Morello's ass and they're going to take over complete control. It would be then that Ricci would combine the fringe crews all into one big monster crime family. Ricci knew without whacking the leadership of the Morellos that there was nothing they could really do unless they killed the hierarchy. The plan was to ambush and kill the leaders of the Morello crime family. So in September of 1916, as hostilities are still sort of bad, Nick Terranova gets suckered into his own death, essentially. Terranova wanted the fighting to stop and put out feelers to see if they could sort of meet and have a peaceful sit down and let it go. So he ends up getting called to a meeting in Brooklyn to meet with Leopoldo Laurentano. Terranova ends up taking Charlie Ubriaco with him. The meeting was, like I said, about peace. Sadly, as Terranova and Ubriaco approached the storefront, which, it's worth noting, was owned by Alessandro Valero, who was a member of the Camorra, they would be shot over a dozen times and left on the pavement to die. Shortly after, Joe Verrazano would be whacked as well. So the Camorra takes it to their ass, and in 1917, Ralph Daniello would become an informant, and he ends up going and telling the police that the Navy Street gang was behind the hits of Terranova and Verrazano and Ubriaco, which would lead to the arrest and conviction of Laurentano and Alessandro for those murders. In 1920, Morello would be released from prison. During his prison stay, Salvatore D'Aquila had left the Morello crime family and had essentially become the boss of bosses in New York City, operating in Morello's territory, including East Harlem and the Bronx. D'Aquila, the one-time captain of the Morellos, had a shitload of power at this point. So as Morello is released, he realizes that D'Aquila is going to be a problem, and he knew that likely there would be an attempt on his life. And so what he does is he goes back to Italy for a couple of months. And he was right, as D'Aquila ordered the death of Morello. So ultimately, Morello ends up coming back to New York. Umberto Valente, pretty much at that point, would then go after Morello and Joe Masseria, who at the time was Morello's ally and protector. A war would essentially ensue, and Valente would eventually be killed by Lucky Luciano in August of 1922. With Valente gone, D'Aquila was wide open for a lot of trouble, because with D'Aquila losing Valente, he lost a lot of power and a lot of tough guys. So Morello, realizing that war would perhaps never end, would promote Joe Masseria to boss, and he would make himself consigliere. And they would go on together for the next several months, making a ton of money as Prohibition would begin. Then the Castellamare War begins, and Morello and Masseria would take on Maranzano and Joe Bonanno. Morello would handle the war plans. He would be the strategist. But in 1930, Morello and Joe Periano end up going to East Harlem to collect numbers receipts. Both get shot and killed, obviously on the orders of Joe Bonanno and Salvatore Maranzano. And that would make them the first two victims of the Castellamare War. It's long been said that Luciano himself planned the hit on behalf of Maranzano. So while Morello was killed, likely because he stayed in business too long, he is really essentially the first boss to use old world rackets and bring them to New York City, especially the protection racket. He not only made the Genovese crime family what it is today, but the very turf that he controlled is still controlled by the Genovese crime family today. He is the godfather of protection rackets. You can't make it any more clear than that. And he was able to align and form one of the most powerful crime families in existence, which is still one of the most powerful crime families today. And that's sort of the life of Joe Morello. And while that's reasonably short and whatever, the one thing that is important that history will look back on as far as he's concerned is that he was able to bring old world rackets to New York City and establish them as the foundation to making money. He, in many ways, was an innovator in every sense of the word. While he was a boss, and he was able to become a boss by asserting his power and dominance by using murder and mayhem. If we look at, today they taught, 1 second. They consistently talk about the Mustache Pete's, and that's what Morello was. He was an old world gangster that brought over an old world gangster mentality from Sicily and employed many of the things, like the initiation rites he brought over, the way that they did the protection rackets, the way they loan sharked. Everything about what he did was taken from the next guy underneath him. Obviously, Ciro Terranova would take over after his brother Nick Terranova was whacked, and he would keep the things that his brother Joe Morello had installed. And if you look at other bosses like Joe Bonanno, same sort of thing. They all came with the old world mentality, but ultimately it would be Maranzano and Masseria who would step ahead and still continue the old world mentality. And it was guys like Lucky Luciano who realized that an old world mentality was not going to be good for business. It wasn't going to be good for the mob. If they were to continue to hold power, they had to put a stop to infighting. And if you look at the Camorra and the Mafia war, while it facilitated greed, because that's really what that war was about. The Morellos, Giuseppe Morello could have easily said, you know what, you guys helped us kill Joe DeMarco, so we're going to have a 50-50 split on the rackets. And the fact that he was so greedy, and we talk about this on this show all the time, the fact that he was so greedy and just had so much power-driven ego, the fact that he couldn't just bypass and say, okay, for the sake of business, you helped me, you could take your 50-50 split here. He refused to do it. So in turn, the Camorra says, well, fuck you and your ass, you prick, with a pine cone in the reverse kind of fashion. We are going to just sort of set up shop, and we're going to compete against you, and that's ultimately what creates the war. And these are things like visionaries like Lucky Luciano, which he was in every sense of the word, saw. He realized that infighting was not good, that the bottom line should always be, let's make as much fucking money as we possibly can, let's form a commission, let's get together, and let's settle beefs, because money, ultimately, at the end of the day, is what we're in business for. Money before all. And that's one of the things that Luciano realized growing up around these guys, is what the trappings and misfortunes and the failures could be. And that's one of the reasons why when Maranzano ends up getting rid of Joe Masseria, he realizes immediately, if we don't capitalize on getting rid of Maranzano, this is going to keep repeating itself. And really, if you look at the juxtaposition of how the mob, the entomology of the Mafia, with them bringing over the way that the Sicilian Vespers worked in Sicily over into this country. They used the writings of Niccolo Machiavelli to run business. And when you look at, like I said, when you look at the entomology of all of this, you can see how the mob grew and got better and more sophisticated and more intelligent. And it took guys like Lucky Luciano to expand the rackets and to learn that the trappings of old world thinking and greed was going to be the undoing of the Mafia in every sense. And even if we look at the Cuban thing, and after the Mafia lost Cuba, they still had a lot of power, they still had a lot of strength, but as the Mafia evolves, look at what happened to Luciano. He outlived his usefulness. While Luciano will always be looked back as sort of the godfather of organized crime, and Morello will be looked back as the one guy that really honed extortion and loan sharking and the protection rackets. Every single one of these people we talk about, even if Morello didn't have like this 40-year reign, it's the little things that he brought to organized crime from Sicily that helped organized crime go to where it got. And then Luciano steps in and they evolve. Then after Luciano goes, they evolve differently. And that's just the reality of the mob. The mob is always going to evolve. Always. They're never going to change. So when we look back at Morello, we look back at how he ruled. He wasn't afraid to dismember. He wasn't afraid to murder. And every other boss saw that as a means to an end. They would murder. So everything set before them, they would carry down traditionally. And even today, we can see bits and pieces of Morello. Roy DeMeo make any sense to you? So there you go. So while Morello may not have been, Carmine Galante by any stretch of the imagination, or even a Barney Bellomo or any of these other guys, he still has his rightful place in history. He was still an innovator in every sense of the imagination, but one has to wonder what Morello's longevity could have been if he hadn't have been greedy. And that's what we always go back to on the show, greed. All right, so with that, that is going to be the show for this week. If you get a chance to donate, please donate. All donations go to upgrades and for better shows. Like I said, people have donated. If you can donate $1, $10, $20, all the money goes right back into the show and enables us to do what we want to do. And it is going to enable us to have a very big inclusive site, which is going to be very inexpensive. And we're really excited about that. We have a couple of little documentary projects that will be coming out probably in the next couple of months. We've got some projects. We also got a big Detroit show coming. Lots of things to talk about, lots of things to do. In the meantime, we will be back next week with an all-new show. And like I said, if you can donate, please donate. Our PayPal information is within the description under this radio show. There's also, I think, a photo that's going into this that gives the PayPal link, even if it's $1. Every little bit helps to do a show. A lot of research goes into this. I do have to pay for a Pacer account, which, if you don't know what that is, it's court documents. They're 10 cents a fucking page. It's not cheap. So for me to get transcripts and stuff like that I need to do certain things, it costs money. And, you know, I've been doing this for 3 years now. We're over 109 shows in at this point, and I still enjoy doing it. And I'm looking forward to the live shows and live call-ins and stuff like that, which we're going to do. But everything that we do costs a little bit of coin. I hate to say that, but it is. And for 3.5, 4 years now, I fronted the cost of everything, and I just can't do it anymore. And that's the reality of it. It's expensive to do. And with upgrades comes guests. We've got a bunch of guests lined up, but I don't want to start doing that until we move to the new site, and that's why I pushed all them back. But we got a lot of things planned. So any complaints, threats, you know where to send them. Go over to Facebook and type in Mob Talk Radio. You can give a like, subscribe, follow along. We got an Instagram account, Mob Talk Radio. We are not on Twitter anymore. Just too many social fucking media platforms. Just late breaking, there was another hit in in Hamilton yesterday. It was a member of the Musitano crime family. So I'm going to do a little more research, see what I can find about that, but it looks like it's in a mob hit, so it looks like Canada's back to popping caps and asses. All right, so all that being said, I appreciate everybody who donates, everybody who will donate, everybody that supports the page. Can't do it without you. Without you, the page is nothing. So with all that being said, have a great rest of the week. Fucking spring is here. Here comes the fucking allergies, those rat bastards. But all that being said, we will be back next week with a brand new show. Probably on Wednesday of next week or Tuesday of next week. Go to Facebook, type in Mob Talk Radio, and go down and you will see a post that says Q&A and go. That's your opportunity to throw a question. If not, you can message me personally. Again, I wanted to thank everybody for listening, and I look forward to seeing all of you next week.